Welcome, everybody, to another installment of Inside Reality, where we talk about obvious things and we dissect obvious things. And we often take a dialectic approach. My associate and producer, Jimmy Tran, to my right, I guess to your left, if you're looking that way, he generally takes a position that's antithetical to mine. Oftentimes we agree. Most of the time we're somewhere in the middle, but we're not like most of these dumb echo chamber podcasts where the both hosts are like, "Oh, you're so wonderful," that social admiration society, all that dumbness. So we talk about obvious things. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria, and this is my producer and co-host of Inside Reality. Tell your friends, share this with your friends, Mr. Jimmy Tran. How you doing, Jimmy?
Hey everyone, good. I'm excited. This is another fun episode. We always have fun. We definitely don't always agree. However, we do, because we respect each other, and and also I think that we both conduct ourselves in life and so forth is being respectful of other people. I mean, we may not agree, with what's going on in the world, but we respect, and we're willing to have a conversation. And that's
Yeah.
one of the things I appreciate about you, is that, so.
Well, I appreciate that. I think you're a little bit more of a genteel, congenial soul than I am. I'm a little more bellicose by nature. At the same time, concomitantly, I do try to conduct myself respectfully, but that's often a challenge for me because I struggle with, again, because this is called Inside Reality, and I don't
Yeah.
really care if
Well,
I
that's the whole
dis-
point of the show.
disclose
Yeah.
my deepest secrets. But my mother died when I was a kid, and I still struggle with love because I'm insecure about love. So I think I project a lot of anger and always have. But like I was telling somebody this morning when I was playing pickleball, there are people that either create or destroy. I'm a creator, so I channel all my anger toward trying to be productive and creative. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And and I just wish more people were aware of their dark side and channeled it to be more of a creative situation. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about is today's topic is, Jimmy, how obvious are obvious things?
Yeah.
And right now, as we're conducting this podcast, a lot of those riots and destruction are happening not only in LA, but in Dallas and Chicago,
Yeah.
in, I believe, San Antonio now and
And
other
in
places.
Minnesota, they had some, I think, or
Yeah.
they were about to anyway.
And yet some of the what I call democratic machine and some of the talking heads on some of the media platforms that propagate narratives and talking points like CNBC and CNN, all those, many of those hosts are saying out loud, while we're watching destruction and violence, mostly peaceful riot or mostly peaceful
Oh,
protests, which
protesters. Yeah.
which I don't understand. I guess technically, if you were to count in LA, for example, let's say there's 5,000 persons, right?
Yeah.
Jimmy, help me with this.
And let's
Maybe,
say
maybe,
just a dozen
yeah,
people.
right. Yeah, I was going to get to there. Let's say of that 5,000, maybe 4,500 are protesting, but there are 500 that are looting and
Or
destroying.
even
And
less than that.
yeah,
Let's say just 20 people,
yeah,
right? You can say that's mostly peaceful because,
you could
I mean, from a
technically say
relative
that.
number standpoint, yeah. So that's one
But
position.
having said that, if you and me, two people, go to an intersection in Detroit, Michigan, and start destroying property and looting and confronting police officers, that's going to be recognized as a confrontation and criminal activity. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
I
not
mean, typically speaking, yeah.
it's not going to be recognized as two a Chinese and a Hispanic in Detroit, Michigan, confronting and looting and destroying property were mostly peaceful when they were arrested. That's not how it's going to play out. When that little story is being covered. So my question to you is, when we're watching obvious destruction, that's the part that hasn't been covered as much either.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not just the confrontation and the violence and the taking over of streets. There's also a lot of destruction going on, and yet as we're watching it, some of the headlines are like protests.
Yeah.
as opposed to destruction, violence,
Yeah.
looting, and taking over streets.
Well, I mean, you got to remember that the way that the media, I mean, that's part of who's playing this out, right? I mean, literally, I saw a news clip where there was a news person saying, I don't know what's going on, but look at all this, I mean, what they said was that people are just here peacefully, protesting, sitting here watching a car burn. I mean, literally, that's what he says.
I know.
The peaceful protest, watching a car burn. So you have to ask.
And by the way, somebody owns that car, and it's their property.
But they're peacefully there watching that car burn.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff that's happening. That's kind of, it is bizarre, and certainly the media is culpable in terms of how they frame it. Now, like we were saying, I mean, part of it, that is part of what we're seeing is that, like we talked about before, the narrative that is set before us is what is framed so that we get to see what they want us to see, essentially.
Yeah, selective
right?
perception.
I don't like to say they, because it's like this
Yeah,
is they versus us and that kind of stuff, because it's not useful when we don't really know who it is. But I think we do, because nowadays, at least we know the people that are doing it on the front side, right? We have senators and Congress people that are doing that, and so we can literally call them out for their either hypocrisy or
let's do this. We're talking today. This is Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria. This is Jimmy Tran. Today we're talking about how obvious are obvious things. And to me, it's obvious that there are these destructive, violent riots happening across the country as we speak, in opposition of ICE and some of that. But anyway, so Maxine Waters, okay, not exactly the most intellectually enlightened person in the world. Don't get mad. It's true. Now she goes on and publicly states, "Oh, I was down there. They're just peacefully protesting." And then she says something so dumb like, "Nobody got shot. Nobody got killed.
So therefore it must be peaceful, right?"
So therefore, according to her ridiculous logic of vapid brain cells that are operating in her world, and she's a congressperson putting forth this message for the public record, and it's just clear that doesn't square with people taking over streets, confronting police officers, whether you like them or not, destroying property, looting, and again, obviously, committing acts of violence, destruction, and rioting. I mean, how do you square that with a congressperson?
Now, let me give her the benefit of the doubt for a moment. Okay, like I said, this is part of what we do. At least this is how I try to frame things.
That's
okay.
What we do.
Well,
that's what we do.
Yeah. So remember, the whole riot situation didn't occur in the full scope of the time that the protests took place, right? So it's just like, I mean, I think we talked about this before. If not, like there's a celebration of winning the Super Bowl or winning the World Series or whatever, right? And so you have all these people out there, they're celebrating, they're jubilant and whatever. But quickly, some of those things can turn into violence and turn into chaos and riots and looting.
Which they did.
Which they do. That happens even in the cases of just celebration of victory and stuff. I mean, your city wins this trophy, big trophy, and then you destroy the city. I mean, that's kind of the framework. But now, to her credit, in the sense that, well, maybe credit not the right term, but to her benefit, right? When she was there, obviously she didn't see any of the violence or any of that, and so that's the frame that she's speaking from. Okay, I was there. I didn't see all of that happening. Now, of course, she hasn't taken it the next step, which is, when I was there, it didn't happen, right? But then doesn't acknowledge the fact that it is happening now.
Because most of the violence and destruction happens after dark,
after the fact,
under the cover of darkness.
Sure.
So technically, technically she's there at 3 p.m.,
Sure, whenever it is. Yeah.
on a Tuesday with her little guards and her little entourage. Oh, I didn't see anything happening.
Yeah.
But you can't tell me that she's not aware of what happened the other 7 or 8 days later under the cover of darkness
Sure.
with all the destruction and looting.
Well,
That's where she's it's almost like just because you don't tell somebody that you saw somebody that you witnessed a rape, that doesn't mean the rape didn't happen. And by the way, I think you're partly culpable for not reporting
yeah.
that rape, so to speak. I mean,
Agree.
I'm being,
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
same kind of thing. She's aware that in her own city or state, rather, that all this chaos and destruction was going on, but I guess her hatred for Trump is so palpable. I don't know that she's willing to withhold a truth, right?
Yeah.
In order to propagate
That narrative that she
that
wants to
talking
frame.
point
That.
that, well, I was there, I didn't see anything happen.
Yeah. Well,
know.
even the mayor of Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
The guy with the gel? Do I have gel
I
in
don't
my hair?
remember, but anyway.
Oh, you're talking about Bass.
Bass. Yeah. Yeah.
Mayor Bass. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the gel guy, the governor.
Oh, the governor. No, I'm talking about the mayor of Los Angeles, right? I mean, he or she, initially said the same thing, but then I heard her recent statement that there's a curfew.
Yeah.
That if you're out past this certain time, you're going to be arrested and prosecuted
Right.
and so forth, and that violence and destruction of property and all that must stop, right? So obviously she has now recognized at this point that this is not, a favorable situation, apparently, and get on that,
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if she's still promoting it as peaceful protest or whatever, but certainly, of course, all of this, of course, is after the deployment of the National Guard, right? Because that's where the contention was. Okay, well, you can't deploy the National Guard, and patrol the streets if you're not invited, right? The posse comitatus, there's a law that prohibits military from enforcement on local streets. There's a separation.
Yeah, but
of powers.
remember that the immigration laws that we're talking about
Yeah.
are federal laws.
Agree.
So, and remember, this is not unprecedented. In 1964, somewhere
Sure.
in there, when that white supremacist Klansman, Governor Wallace in Alabama,
Yeah.
didn't allow a black student to go to the University of Alabama.
Yeah.
I think it was either Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney
Senator
General.
or attorney. Yeah.
I think he deployed under the auspices of that idiot President Lyndon Johnson. I never could stand that guy. But anyway, they deployed under federal auspices or federal authority the National Guard and the military, rather, to enforce integration at the University of Alabama.
Sure.
You remember that? So it has happened before without the governor soliciting the help of that extrinsic military, authority, if you will. Do you remember that? Well,
Yeah,
you don't
no, I
remember,
mean,
but
well, that- I
I'm
mean,
sure
that
you
was
read
before
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read about it. I don't know. I don't have all the details of that, but I did read about that in history book and stuff. It was a little before my time, but the other, I mean, we've seen that happen many different times, right? I mean, at various times. So that.
Well, here in Albuquerque, during the riots that took place in 1971, I was
Yeah.
a little boy, but you weren't born. But there was the National Guard protecting stores and certain areas from the violence that was taking place here in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
There were all kinds of protests here.
There's default position or default mission that the National Guard and certain, like, so the National Guards are the my understanding are guardsmen that are permitted to be federalized when the president needs them, but they are actually,
or the governor of the state.
governor, but they actually are the military units that belongs to the state. Not
right.
They're not U.S. Army, basically, is what I'm saying.
No, of course
they're
not.
actually the
It's another layer of sort of like an
Separating the power.
operation well, but also another layer of an operational apparatus to
Yeah.
enforce law
Yeah.
or to maintain or
Order.
to resist and thwart chaos
Chaos. Yeah.
to ensure order, I guess. Right.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean that's why the Insurrection Act was of 1807, I think, was instituted in order to allow the president to make that determination when
Right.
an insurrection scenario. I mean, certainly an insurrection scenario is there's multiple layers, right? I mean, there's the insurrection on a federal level, meaning that but then there's also insurrection within the local level
Right.
that potentially, and but all the different layers of governance, like
Right.
because really the governor is the president of the state, and of
Yes.
course, then you have the sheriff, which is the county,
Yeah.
the authority, and then you have the cities, which are
Yeah.
and then you have the mall cops, or the security guard at the Walmart or whatever, and those are the enforcement authorities on those, or the university campuses and so forth, right? So those are the order of, and then of course our home, we are the guard, and the
Well, it's called
the executor.
It's called a protector of your castle.
Yeah,
And
the
there's an
castle doctrine. Yeah.
There's an actual doctrine there. But
Yeah.
I want to go back to something real quick. Again, this is Inside Reality. We're with you. We drop the show every Thursday. You can subscribe. Please share. If you'd like to sponsor the show, my name's Jeffrey Candelaria. This is Jimmy Tran. How can they do that, Jimmy?
Simply, we provide a link to our Patreon. It's simple. You set it up. You can make a contribution there. You can subscribe. You can cancel anytime. We're also adding other sponsorships so that we can insert and actually promote the businesses. The way we're doing it now allows those. So there's a certain level of permanence as well, because we're going to be embedding right now those sponsors into our early videos, like right now, because that's just the way it works. And so that means that as we get more and more popular, as we gain subscribers and people watching, those businesses will continue to receive those benefits. Yeah. And then of course we've got
Just like my friend Julius Gaius Caesar. He started out as a senator, and then he became a pro consul.
Yeah.
Then he became a dictator, and then he became dictator for life. And now everybody knows Caesar.
Well, he's dead now, but yeah.
Yeah, but next month is July, named after my friend Julius. When's the last time you had a month named after you? Anyway,
that's true.
Getting back to a couple of things. So a lot of people have been asking. Today we're talking about how obvious are obvious things.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what we do anyway on this show, Inside Reality.
Yeah.
But why do you need to call the military out in L.A.? Because L.A., the APD of L.A., or the Albuquerque Police Department of L.A.,
LAPD,
LAPD, they're short-staffed anyway, right? They haven't been this short-staffed since the 1990s. Last I checked, LA is the second largest city in the country, and if you count all the surrounding area, there's something like 15 million people there, okay? But anyway,
Easily, yeah.
But the LA area itself, you're talking about 8, 9, 10 million folk, right? So their police department is under-resourced anyway, right?
Yep.
And so now when you have to deploy all those resources, or most of those resources, to that area where the riots are happening, well, guess what? Crime's happening all over LA already anyway, right?
Yeah.
That's why Trump proactively supplemented, at least by way of visual deterrent, if you will, the National Guard. Point number two, Mayor Bass, who you referred to earlier, she said something that's unequivocally absurd and ridiculous as well the last couple of days. She said, "Oh, these peaceful protests," I don't think she used the word riot, but these incidences were confined to a 3-block area.
Yeah.
That's like saying, there were 39 rapes committed in a 2-block area. Don't worry about it. The rest of the city, all you women, you're fine. I mean, How can a mayor of a city say something so dumb that just because the violence and destruction is confined to an area, that it's still not requisite of completely eliminating those threats to the public, not to mention taking over a street is wrong because it prevents people from going to work, emergency vehicles from doing their job. I mean, you just can't take over streets in
Yeah.
any place and say, oh, it's only confined to a small area of our city. What are your thoughts on that? To me, it's hyper
So
ridiculous.
yeah, I mean that is one of the challenge. I didn't hear that, but I mean in terms of what she said there, but that's okay. You know, it's not. But I do want to continue and finish my thought on the deployment. So my understanding is that, and certainly the timing of it is important, right? Because the deployment of the troops, my understanding was simply to assist federal agents because there was the attacks on the
Well, they were protecting the federal buildings,
federal
really.
buildings, and then also ICE agents that were being
Yeah.
harassed and attacked.
Right.
So that actually is within the confines of
It's a great point. Yeah.
of the law in terms of the National
point.
Guard being deployed for that.
Great
The
point.
assistance to LAPD and all that is ancillary and is
Correct.
only and it's only even permitted when the request is made to enact that transition.
It's a great point
And
you're making. Very good point.
One other thing real quick too in that regard is that, you know, in terms of the framework of how what we're dealing with here too is that the activities, I mean, the National Guardmen are not out there arresting people and all that. They're there as supplemental to support law enforcement.
Yeah,
More as a show of force.
they're not confronting the
Exactly.
frontline people that are protesting, committing
Correct.
violence.
That's
to my
generally
knowledge,
not the case. Yeah.
to this date,
They're
as
still
of
not doing
as
that.
of this broadcast, no National Guard person has confronted any of those destroyers of property or the people that are committing the acts of violence. You're right. Great point.
Yeah, yeah, and so
this-
they're there
to
more as a
this point
support
in
system.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So even when they are enacted, usually they are there to just support. So for instance, the police are out there doing their part, and they're there to make sure that they're able to have water or food or whatever
Right.
it is that you know the whole apparatus needs in order to support them, so they don't have to divert the resources to run operations.
Right.
You know?
Or to protect a perimeter around the cruisers. Or
Exactly.
all the
Again, it's just a
equipment.
presence kind of thing. Usually is enough, and then
Yeah.
you know. Now on the other side, there's also federal agents.
But I want to underscore your point
is
because that was a really cogent point you made, Jimmy. So good job.
Thank you.
the
Appreciate
the
it.
National Guard was coupled to the federal element
Correct.
present in in that LA area.
Yeah.
The federal buildings, the
Correct.
ICE agents who themselves are federal
Federal
officers.
officers,
So
yep.
so the National Guard was married to or wedded to the federal presence
Yep.
that's there in and of itself. So that's
Yeah.
that's a really good point.
Because there's also another branch of federal agencies that are in play as well, and that is like, for instance, the FBI. Or, you know, I mean,
Absolutely.
they're on the investigation side, but there's also a part where they do the arrests and they
surveillance
execute
too. They do
surveillance. Yep, and then they execute on warrants and all that kind of stuff. And that's actually, I on my way over to get ready for this show, you know, I heard of an incident in, I think it was in Minnesota or somewhere, where there was federal agents that were. So what had happened was that the federal agent, I guess word got out that federal agents was about to raid a business or property or whatever, and so all these people went out and started protesting and so forth. And it turned out that they weren't really there. They weren't ICE agents. They were actually different agents. They were there. They they arrested or they executed on a warrant. It was a human trafficking situation that was being taken down. It was a ring. I mean, they arrested and they saved like 12 people that were going to be human trafficked, and they've also like unearthed like 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine. I mean, so literally, that was the operation. But these protesters, apparently, they went out there. They thought that these were ICE agents, so they got in the way. And then, of course, now they got arrested for rioting and creating disruption of the federal investigation or federal whatever actions that they were doing. So anyway, it's very interesting that those things are kind of happening all at different times.
Well, and back to your thought about the FBI presence in LA. I think it was LA today. Again, this is a podcast, so whatever today is, today happens to be June 12th, 2025.
Yeah.
That's arbitrary, but we'll get into that another time. But an FBI cadre of agents identified one of those destructive, violent, quote unquote, protesters that threw a Molotov cocktail at a police officer. And that person was identified based on FBI technology and surveillance and all of that. And that person was actually taken into custody and probably is going to do 15 to 20 years, thank God.
Yeah.
Because you can't throw a bomb at an officer. I don't care who the hell you are.
Well, he was masked up, so they couldn't see it on one, but they were able to do investigation and found who he was and arrested him. Yeah.
Which is another really interesting point, because throughout this, you've heard these fat donut eater politicians saying, oh, the ICE agents are cowards and the police, because they're masked. Well, yet the violent protesters I see on television committing the acts, they're all wearing masks too. So come on, And ironically, during COVID, we were told to wear masks, So this whole mask thing has got its own little, monstrous element to it in and of itself, But anyway.
What's interesting about masks is that I think there was a federal law or something where you couldn't go into a federal building or like a bank, for instance. You can't go into a bank with a mask on.
Of course not.
Until the whole COVID thing. Then all of a sudden that was, and actually there are people that took advantage of that, of course, during the COVID period where they went in and they
robbed banks,
robbed banks and stuff.
And they robbed
so
stores.
it's like, I mean, it's again, an obvious, right? I mean, this is like,
it's an obvious thing. Right.
I mean, so I don't have pets. But I have a dog. I have a friend that has dog, right? And he loves his bone, And and if you set down food next to it, it doesn't matter what it is, right? He's gonna go for it
obsessed with the bone.
That's just that's the way it works.
Yeah. Again, this is Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria. This is Jimmy Tran. We're with you every Thursday. We drop the show on Thursday.
Yeah.
You can watch us anytime, of course. We talk about obvious things, and we try to apply curiosity, a critical mind to it, and some conviction, right? And some dialectic analysis, meaning Jimmy kind of takes a different view than I do oftentimes, not always. And today we're talking about something as obvious as what was happening in LA. I don't know if it still is when you watch this podcast, was obvious destruction, obvious violence. And here's the other thing. You can't just take over a street and call it a protest.
Or a whole city block, which is
or a whole city block.
Yeah.
I guess you can call it a protest, but you can't retain the presence there for more than a 12-hour period or whatever the local law says.
Well, there's this thing called trespassing. So
it's not.
So if you don't own that property, okay, and you're on there beyond a very period of time, whatever that time is that is designated for you to be there, it's called trespassing.
Even a public park.
Even in a public park. I mean, those city ordinances lay those out, and that's how you can get, criminal.
And a lot of people like, well, why can't you? Well, for one thing, you've got traffic. People going to work, people that have storefronts there or stores,
disturbing the peace, and
and
obstructing.
Not to mention emergency vehicles.
Yep.
That kind of thing. If there's an actual fire or a cataclysm, the fire department or whatever needs access to those streets to do its job. But you just can't take over a street and say that, it's just a protest.
Yeah.
You are breaking the law.
Well, you can if you get a permit. Right?
Well, yes, but even the permit's going to have a certain limitation.
Of course.
In a 24-hour period.
Although,
cycle.
Okay, so let's take another angle on this. Okay, there's two angles that I want to kind of dissect in that, because the First Amendment, right, gives us what? Freedom of speech, right? Meaning that we can say what we want without any
to certain limits. You can't yell fire in a movie theater, but
yeah, okay. I'll give you that.
Within
But
limits, yeah.
within limits, okay. Yeah, I mean, you can't foment violence, kill the guy or whatever, right? I mean, that's you can't do that. But in general, you can say what you want, especially political speech, right? I mean, that's where it's protected, right? I mean,
Right.
even things that you don't have to agree with the other person,
Yeah.
they have the right to say it. So
Right.
that's the first layer. Then there's the freedom of religion, which is also part of the First Amendment, meaning that
Right.
you have the right to believe whatever you want, choose to believe whatever you want, even teach and speak whatever you want, whether it's there's a comet and it's coming to take you away, and you can believe that, as long as again you don't cross into harming somebody with your speech and whatnot, then you're fine. There's actually a third clause, right, which is the freedom to assemble peacefully. Okay, that's a really important term. Peacefully assemble.
Mhm.
Once it becomes no longer peaceful, again, this is why I think that this is being framed as a peaceful protest, because then you, by the First Amendment, you are given that protection, okay, from governmental encroachment. Even if there is a ordinance or any kind of restriction for you to be there, okay, so just so you know, and so in general, spontaneous protest without a permit can still happen
Right.
within the First Amendment's
But
context. So that's why I just want
but
to
the
point
authorities,
that.
the authorities in that local jurisdiction, if it's let's say 4 a.m.
Yeah.
local jurisdiction and people are peacefully protesting, at some point the local authority is still going to break it up because
Plus,
because you
they
have,
can.
because you have to operate the city street and have people go back and conduct their business.
Well,
But they're
again,
still allowed to protest. You're right. But
well, no, to a degree. Like I said, I mean, let's say they have a sit-in, right? Everybody sit down or lie down on the ground
right.
for the whole night, okay, violating this rule of ordinance, right? I mean,
Right.
so the First Amendment is the rule setting, right? The ordinances are the ones that are trying to get practical about how those get
Right.
implemented.
No, I
okay?
get that. Yeah,
so
yeah.
so that's what I'm saying is that said if you have an assembly of, let's say, 1,000 people and they're all just sitting there peacefully, okay, they're
Right.
not throwing anything, they're not yelling or screaming, but they're
So then
peacefully being
so
there.
then it so
Even
then
if it
it
violate, hold on,
then
even
it
if they
comes
violate
then
the
it comes
ordinance,
down to the local sheriff or the local chief of police who says, I'm going to give these people a certain latitude
to agree, yeah,
in the spirit of peaceful protesting.
yeah.
And if I were the local sheriff or whatever the hell authority in that area, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and you have all these hippies smoking dope and peacefully sitting and taking their clothes off or whatever the hell they're doing,
Well, yeah,
in the
yeah.
spirit of them allowing for the protest to unfurl, I'm not going to be a hard ass and probably break it up until maybe noon the next day or something like that.
Or
Because technically, there are ordinances that says you can't occupy that street. So it's
okay,
going to be in that particular case where they're peacefully protesting under your hypothetical. I think it comes down to the good judgment of the local authority figure there.
to an
Are you with
extent.
Are you with
I
me
mean,
there?
I'm following your logic there, but I think that to an extent, from a pure constitutional argument standpoint, okay, ordinance and statutes do not and cannot violate the Constitution either. So just because there's an ordinance that says 10 o'clock, you got to break it up, okay, doesn't mean that you have to break it up per se from a constitutional standpoint. Now obviously, if I get punched by a police officer or I get pulled and dragged off by a police officer, obviously I might react in a way that would now escalate it to a level where it no longer is peaceful, right? And so that's the tipping or kind of like the teetering of it, right? So now let's imagine for a moment that everyone there was just sitting around in this park. So they're not instructing traffic, but they're just singing songs and having a good time and just hanging out, okay? And even when tear gases are thrown in, they just put on their gas mask because they're prepared for that, and you just keep sitting there and, again, not, right? Now, if the police comes in and picks them up and drag them out, the next person comes and sits down in their spot in the same manner, all completely peaceful. Again, this is exactly what happened to a certain extent with Gandhi and what happened in India that literally toppled the British Empire, okay? Because they literally had this mass movement of peace, nonviolence, okay? But nonviolence from the standpoint of resistance. There's a term for it. I forget. But anyway, passive resistance kind of a thing. Okay, and compliance is not required. Again, constitutional rights. And if they force you and they put whatever, then they are violating the Constitution.
What about the public's right to have access to that park?
Well,
that's also
again,
that's
no,
also something to be considered too, isn't it?
To an extent. But that's all hypothetical because there's nobody there that's coming in arguing that I want that spot in the park, right?
Because the public's afraid to go near those dumb hippies that are sitting there singing songs and welcoming tear gas as per your hypothetical.
Well, again, this is hypothetical, right? So I get that there won't be people sitting around if there's tear gas thrown in, right? People are just going to get up and leave, and that's how they get the crowds broken up in these scenarios. But I'm just saying that hypothetically, if they were able to resist all of those attempts to shift them out, right? So they basically would have to physically carry them out of that space, okay? Then obviously there's a different dynamics there that is at play because now you're escalating it to violence and
Well, I'm not sure what your point is. So the local authority under that auspices, these hippies taking over
they really can't do anything.
So
according to the Constitution.
Let me finish
Okay.
my point or question. So under your scenario, the hypothetical, you got 1,000 hippies occupying a park in Albuquerque, New Mexico, not to your point, bothering anybody, but you're still denying the public from access to that park. Okay, fine.
Well, you're not.
Well, let me finish.
Okay.
They're also defecating, they're urinating there. All that other stuff has to happen. It's called human biology. How long under your scenario, under your interpretation of the Constitution, should this protest be allowed to happen before this intervention happens? A week, 3 days, or can they forever occupy that public space?
If you're a strict constitutionalist, it can happen forever.
Oh, forever. Well, first of all, it can't be forever because nothing lasts forever, not even planet
forever
Earth.
In the sense that it could be happening a long time. Where, again, I'm just talking about strict constitutionalists, peaceably assemble, First Amendment right in that position. Now, of course, it's not going to happen forever because you're right. People are going to get tired. They're going to get bored. They're going to get agitated or whatever it is, right? They're going to get, and so different scenarios plays out. And so that's why it never happens and stays very long. Just like you can commit the perfect crime, but if you can't shut up about it, which most people won't.
So Albuquerque has about 800,000 people. Your scenario, 1,000 hippies taking over the thing. As a pure constitutionalist, they can occupy that park forever. What about the other 700,000 people, 700 and whatever?
Well, they have every right to be down there too.
So there's right. So
I'm saying there's no denying that space.
Further, the public watching this probably play out on their little phones and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Aren't they going to demand at least most common sense tax
not
paying?
necessarily.
Aren't they going to demand, that there be some order happening?
Well, there is order.
Where?
Think about that. I'm saying peaceful sit-in scenario, right?
Peaceful protest has a certain gravity, but taking over a public space also has a certain gravity.
Well, no. Okay, you saying to deny? I'm not denying anybody to sit next to me or be in the same park. So I'm not denying anybody of that. Obviously, if I'm in that chair and you want that chair and you insist on having that chair, okay, I'll give you that chair and I'll move to the next spot. So what I'm saying is that, of course, this is a thought experiment. Obviously.
What about 7 minutes?
But my point is that the Constitution, from a First Amendment, peaceful assembly, right?
Well, what happened to that little city that those dumbbells created in Seattle?
But
how is that different? They created their own city that they claimed was a city in the middle of a metropolitan city with about 4 million people called Seattle, Washington, about 4 years ago. What happened to those
the autonomous zone. Okay, so first off, there's several things constitutionally, right? For one, they declared an independent country, not just a city. Okay, so that's the first thing that they crossed that line, right? So that's an insurrection, right? So that automatically is a, I mean, you can argue that that's an insurrection because by the act of declaring independence is an insurrection, right? So you can make that
But I thought the other part of an insurrection was you had to overthrow the current government part as part of that
sure.
calculation.
It could be,
So
and that may
it's
be
a
so.
half
That might be
insurrection.
so. So it might not be considered insurrection. Okay,
It's a
fine.
half insurrection.
It's a half insurrection. So, but okay, now let's take this whole thought. There was violence, and there was not peaceful within that center. I mean, people.
Oh, okay.
There was a guy that died on the lawn there, right? So they wouldn't let police or fire or whatever get in there to retrieve even and figure out what happened and so there was that part of it too. So right there, once those things happen, it's no longer a peaceful assembly. So therefore, it is no longer protected. You see what I'm saying? So that's what I'm saying. When I drew this out in this hypothetical, I was saying, okay, let's defy all of human whatever. And we have full constraint over ourselves, and we are peaceful at all time, regardless of what they do to us. And we plan for all those contingencies. And if they don't come and grab us and take us out, we can theoretically, given protection of the Constitution.
What I'm arguing on inside reality is the element of peaceful that you continue to put forth doesn't carry enough gravitas to outweigh local authority and the functionality of a given village. I hate saying community. Ugh, I hate saying that.
Right,
a local village, town, or metropolitan area.
Township is good. Yeah.
Township. Okay. So that township has the right to function.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you're overstating the gravity of peace and claiming that just because this peaceful protest is happening, that because it's peaceful, that it outweighs the functionality of a local village or town. And I don't think it does.
Well,
I don't think it does.
Where does it sit in terms of the Constitution? That's what I'm saying. Is that it's a Constitution. So remember, Constitution is the constraint on government. Okay, that's really important and as a distinction.
Yeah, just like the 10 minutes and the 10 minutes are the awarding of the individual and the individual liberties. So again, Jimmy, your argument that just because the element of peaceful in this protest, I don't think that's dispositive enough to allow for that protest to continue without some kind of end, because my position is the local authority in that village, town, or city would want to restore the cycle of functionality.
Sure.
So that's where this argument of these peaceful sit-ins, yes, under the Constitution, you have the right to do that, but I don't think even the Constitution, a constitutionalist attorney would argue that a peaceful protest can't just continue without end. There has to be some disruption of it to allow for that local operation of that city, village, or town to just function. Got about 3 minutes. Got about 3 minutes.
Yeah. No, again, I agree that there is a certain end that must take place from a cyclical standpoint. I was just purely arguing from the standpoint of pure constitution position, right? Constitutional position, provided that, of course, everything and everyone remain peaceful through the whole term of the whole situation, regardless of what the government side does to us, right? I mean, because remember, the protection is, or the restraint is on government, not the other way around, okay? Yeah. So the laws and the statutes, the ordinance, and all those things are there for civil society to say, okay, we agree together that we're gonna do whatever, right? So as long as, for instance, whoever that group is, continuously allow people to come and just sit and be peaceful like everybody else, and there's no shoving and no punching and so forth, right, then there is no end to it from a pure constitutional standpoint. But
a particularly cogent point under your hypothetical is where does this peaceful protest happen? If it's in a park, there may be more allowances for the
It,
continuance. If
it,
it's blocking a freeway or an interstate or taking over a street, that's a different
it,
the allowance, I think, of the liberty under that local jurisdiction would not be as liberal, because I
well,
think now that you're blocking possibly an interstate, now you're talking about emergency vehicles, people
sure.
going to work, all of that. So I
Okay.
think the location is extremely poignant here as well, in terms of how much liberty that local jurisdiction will allow
Yeah, I mean, and again, if you're in the public
for
space, then
its
that means,
continuance.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the public space, really, it's in a way, I mean, unconstrained, right? Meaning that as long as the majority doesn't I mean, like for instance, let's say this continues on and more people gather and accumulates, right? Where started with 2, 3, 5, 10, and then you've got 1 million people just congregating there peacefully. Okay, that's what I mean. I mean, so it's, I know, of course, it will never happen because my brother poked me, no touch me, whatever, right? I mean, that all happened, and so the peace is no longer going to be there. But I'm just saying, hypothetically, you got this full constraint of individuals that are willing to stay in that peaceful lane the whole way through, regardless of what gets thrown at them, right? Then at that point, there is, like I said, there is no limit, no bounds, because unless there's a public sentiment or a public demand
Well, I just think your
removal,
hypothetical of 1 million people is ridiculous, because
I agree,
as you're aggregating these layers of accumulation of
you're going to get
population,
more problems. Yeah.
you're going to have, well, not only more problems, but I think that whatever local authority, they're going to begin to thwart that accumulation of population. All right, man, this is Inside Reality. Today we
Before
were talking about how obvious are obvious things. You got about 30 seconds to conclude.
So there's one other part to this that we didn't really talk about, and that is the part that even though we're given the we have the rights to do this, right? There's also one other dimension, that is that the individual how do I, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So,
So
my position is law and order, common sense,
yeah,
and the cycle of functionality for a local village, town, or metro area is bigger than a peaceful protest. I'm Jeffrey
yeah.
Candelaria, Jimmy Tran. Don't forget to subscribe, share with your friends. Inside Reality.
All right,
Thank you, Jimmy. Nice
all right,
talking to you.
yeah,
Go
I'll remember.
peacefully protest somewhere.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other thing, right? So we'll talk more. I'll try to remember my last thought there. Sorry.
All right. Thank you.
So one of the benefits of being the producer and doing the edits and stuff is that I get to kind of re-engage a little bit and just add to what I was trying to get to at the very end there, that I kind of lost my train of thought, so that it add to the supplement of our conversation, so that you can chew on it a little bit, and then I'll bring it up in the next show so that Jeffrey can respond to my thoughts. But where I was going was that in this whole context of what we were talking about with the obvious not being always obvious, sometimes we lose sight that it's a matter of perspective and perception that defines what is obvious and what isn't obvious, right? I mean, so when we see things a certain way, it's like, for instance, if we were living in a world where where everything was, let's say, green, well, it's obvious that it's green, and so there's not there's this principle that our brain, because of our beliefs, our brain kind of makes sure that we see things a certain way from those beliefs. And obviously, and this is where the obvious that is not so obvious that comes to play, is that when you're in this train of thought, and if you shift and if you change, that can easily happen, or that can happen without you being aware. So which is very, really important that we really dig in and dissect, because otherwise the obviousness, what we see, again, from another person's perspective, may not be so obvious, right? And so because of that, it's because of the beliefs that that other person have. They cannot see it because of those beliefs. And so it's actually very interesting scientifically, what this is. Okay, I don't remember the exact terminology, but I mean, bias is one of the terms. Confirmation bias is one of the ways in which somebody can conclude an outcome because of what their beliefs are. And so even if it's obvious, it's not always clear that that's the obvious. And so that's really important part of it. And of course, when we are then confronted with a certain reality that doesn't match up with our beliefs, there's another term called cognitive dissonance that is in play there as well. Again, this is all stuff that we'll bring up in our next episode, but I want to just kind of leave that as the thought that I had got stuck on right before the end there when we were trying to wrap up. So anyway, hope to see you next time. Thank you again for watching Inside Reality, and as always, please like, subscribe, share, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.